Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with Season 2 and Episode 71. In the last episode, we went over how the Bengaluru Pete had been planned. If you haven't heard it yet, please do. You'll get a great deal of context. We start today at the point where construction of the Pete had commenced and traders were moving in with their families into spaces allocated for them. This inward migration had to be handled, but more importantly, the Pete needed protection, needed to be defended, and for this, a fort needed to be built. In today's episode, that is the ground that I will cover. But before I plunge into it, a moment to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their generosity, which makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Right. First, let's go over the construction of the Pete itself. Its grid-like layout offered each trade a different zone in which to live and work. I went over the town planning aspects of the Pete in the last episode, but these principles of this grid-like town planning was not an invention of Kempe Gowda's officers and engineers. This was a science that was centuries old. The prescriptions for town planning are available in several ancient Indian texts, collectively called the Shilpa Shastra, or broadly the science of building or architecture. Temples in India, for example, follow the Shilpa Shastra principles rigidly. The principle of dividing urban settlements into rectangular blocks was written in various texts, including the Vastu and Shilpa Shastras, as well as in specific tomes like the Artha Shastra, Devi Purana, Manasara, and the Mayamata. Of these texts, the particular section of immediate interest to us is something called the Padavinyasa, a clear framework for laying out streets and identifying blocks for different functions and different communities. The divisions being the basic modules used to organize settlement into workable units. By the nature of it all, when I say towns, it obviously includes roads and streets. Let's start with roads. Now, roads were seen to serve three main purposes. One, obviously, they carried traffic. Number two, they marked out building plots and eventually determined the layout of a whole settlement. And third, they helped to maintain hygiene by allowing the movement of air through the town. Now, the ancient tomes make suggestions that take into account the use of the roads and the heaviness of the traffic dependent on the roads to determine their width. These classical texts also describe graded streets with different widths to serve different levels of movement. The Devi Purana, for example, gives a very clear guideline. For instance, it specifies that the main royal street, and in Bangalore's case, today that one was called Avenue Road, that the royal street should be 10 dhanus, or roughly 40 cubits wide. A cubit is the length from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. Now, this was seen as wide enough for the movement of people and horses and elephants and vehicles without causing congestion. The Arthashastra, for example, distinguishes roads for carts, cattle, elephants, and pedestrians and gives you a clear argument for alignment and predictable movement. Kempe Gowda's Pete, for example, embraced the principles in the Padavinyasa, which, by the orthodoxy of the Shilpa Shastra, prescribed the number of padas or rectangular block in a given area, and this is what determined its planning. And the Pete followed this pattern with consistency. The layout of the Pete gained its full working shape from the gates that stood around it. Kempe Gowda placed 8 of them along the perimeter, and each of them aligned with the road that crossed the plateau. Now, these Pete gates formed the outer frame of the town, and they linked the internal grid with the larger movement of trade beyond its boundaries, and that was an intentional connection. So let's take a look at some of these gates. On the northern end of Doddupete stood the Yalahanka gate. It opened out towards the old Hiriyauru, which was Kempe Gowda's capital and his domain, Yalahanka. He was the Yalahanka Nada Prabhu. And it also opened out towards the northern trade routes that carried grain, cattle, and forest products into the town. Today, The Mysore Bank building on Kempe Gowda Road stands on its former site. To the northwest of it lay the Yashwantpur Gate. It was the entry point for traders coming in from the Tumukuru side and roads that connected with the western hinterland. The Upparpet police station marks its location today. Upparpete incidentally housed salt or uppu traders and hence its name. Carts that entered through this gate would have moved directly into the western blocks of the Pete, carrying the goods that it did that arrived from the Ghats. On the eastern end of Chikkapete was the Alsur Gate, and the Halasuru Gate police station now occupies that stretch. Now this gate saw steady movement from the agrarian villages on the eastern side, bringing in firewood, vegetables and oilseed. Also located in this particular area, broadly known as the Halasuru Pete in the early days, were the Tiglars, and this was a community of horticulturalists from Tamil Nadu who were brought into Bangalore to help green it. They have a very long history in this city, and uniquely, the Tiglaras worshipped the Pandavas. Every year they take out a procession called the Karaga, and it attracts thousands of people watching it. To the western end again was the Sondekoppa Gate, and this aligned with the road that ran towards Sondekoppa and all the routes descending into the western plateau. Today, the railway overbridge stands where the gate once was. Now caravans carrying salt, arecanut and other goods from the western districts entered through this point. Close by was the Kengeri Gate, and that connected to the road that passed to the fertile agricultural lands of Kengeri and further southwest. A lot of grain from these fields came into the Pete and fed the markets of Akkipete and Ragipete. On the southern end of Doddapete was the Anekal Gate, which opened out towards Anekal, leading to the all-important Kongu trade routes. Today, the Kalasipalaya police station stands where the gate used to be. And again nearby is the Kankanahalli Gate, which is now marked by the entrance to the Vokkaligara Sangha. This one connected the Pete to farming settlements in the south and the east, and again, a whole lot of produce would have come into the town from there. Older records also mention the Bale Gate, and that existed towards the north of the Pete, and it linked with Balepet, which still exists in the Pete today. It's a block that dealt in bangles and associated metal work. The placement of all of these gates provide us with a direct alignment between the craft clusters and the approach roads that supplied the raw material. And these 8 gates faced almost every major direction right across the Deccan Plateau. Each stood where one of these long-distance trade routes pointed towards the Pete. The need for gates facing in almost every direction emphasizes how Bengaluru lay at the nerve center of all the trade routes. So a trader approaching from any side of the plateau would have found a direct route into the town, a gate aligned with his road and his journey, and a main street that led him towards the blocks where he did business. Now these gates obviously influenced the rhythm of the Pete. Through Yelahanka and Yashwantpur came grains and the produce of the northern fields. Through Alsuru Gate came the steady flow of firewood, oil seeds and vegetables and fruits and flowers. The western gates brought in cotton, bamboo, and all of the goods that traveled down from the Ghats, probably also including pepper. And through Anekal was cotton, which came from the fields of Kongu, and livestock and supplies, all from those southern trade routes. Once inside these gates, these streams of movement divided along those 2 axial streets, Doddapete north to south and Chikkapete east to west, and then dispersed into the narrower streets of the block, dropping off the larger ones until, right at the heart of the block where no vehicles could pass, there was only the foot traffic required for people that needed very little movement, such as bamboo workers, for instance. The entire layout of the Pete worked in concert with all of these points of entry. The gates fed the axes fed the blocks, and the blocks held the trades that made the use of the goods that arrived every day. It all made sense, and it all was cohesive, without interruption and without a loss of logic. A visitor could enter from any direction, follow the main street, and arrive at the central square with very little uncertainty. From there, the blocks lay in clear lines, and access to every trade and every community and every craft was assured and it was easy. But a town with open gates and a growing volume of trade faced another requirement: protection. The larger plateau, not the one immediately around Bengaluru but the rest of the Deccan, had seen conflict for generations. And this market town, with its rising population and full stores and such a huge amount of goods coming in from every direction, definitely needed a boundary that could ward off any danger. So when I come back after the commercial, let's talk about the Bengaluru Fort and the defense of the Pete right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hello, I'm back. Before the break, we saw how Bengaluru's Pete had taken its physical shape, how its blocks, streets and gates created a cohesive working town, and why a town with open gates and rising commerce needed more than order. It needed protection. Even the smallest village of the time was susceptible to cattle raids, and there are several Veeragalus or hero stones devoted to people, men, less frequently women, who were killed defending the village from cattle raids. The Bengaluru Pete, with its concentrated volume of very, very expensive and valuable goods, obviously would need a fortified perimeter strong enough to discourage these opportunistic attacks. A strong locally housed defensive force was a requirement, not an option. And this was the basic justification for needing to build a fort. The fort would be convenient in many ways, and I will go over that in just a few minutes from now. But first, I'd like to take a look at a natural geological feature that silently protected the Bengaluru Plateau since the beginning of time. Forming a semicircle of protection around the city are a ring of hills known in older descriptions as the Navadurgas, 9 fortified heights made of rock. Derived from Sanskrit, the word Durga literally means difficult to pass, difficult of access or impassable, and these geological rock formations, towered thousands of feet tall, served as natural strong points long before Kempe Gowda's time. Each Durga stood on an important line of movement right across the plateau. And here is a look at the 9 Durgas or the Navadurgas. Right up to the north were Chennaraya Durga and Devanaraya Durga, and these guarded the routes from Sira and Madugiri and Tumakuru. A short distance east of this was Makali Durga, which controlled the trade routes around it, and not very far from it was the all-important Nandi Durga, the hill that we call Nandi Hills. Inscriptions right from the Ganga and Bana periods show that Nandi Hills had always been of some historical importance. It had been a fortified and a sacred height for centuries earlier, with Jaina and Shaiva shrines on its summit. To the west was Savana Durga, an immense outcrop of granite whose steep faces made it one of the most strong positions on the plateau. A play on the word Savana Durga in Kannada literally means the Durga of death, in recognition of its inaccessibility. Further southwest was Hutri Durga and Huliyuru Durga, and to the south the ridge of Kavala Durga overlooking the Kongu routes. Now between Hutri Durga and the northern line was Bhairava Durga, a very small but a very strategically important hill, and this completed the chain. Each of these hills held older fortifications, stone walls, gateways, water cisterns all cut into the rock, and they were able to sustain garrisons there for a very, very long time. It's not as though any kingdom previously saw fit to link these 9 into a chain. They each existed for themselves, by themselves, were occupied, and became fortifications for various different parikas in charge of those territories. Now together they formed the broad outer boundary of the region that we associate with early Bengaluru. And not only did these Durgas make it impossible for large armies to approach, They obliged trade routes to bend around them or pass between them, and this had the effect of causing them all to spill into the Bengaluru basin. And this is another reason why the Bengaluru Pete's location was a prime location. All that said, Kempe Gowda still needed a fort inside the Pete. There are several reasons why building a fort was as important and strategic as building the Pete itself. Number one, it gave physical security to the town. A fort where garrison troops would be able to defend against invasions, not necessarily only from kingdoms hostile to Vijayanagara, but even neighboring Palegars who may have been jealous of the success of Kempe Gowda and the Bengaluru Pete. Next, protection against bandits. Now, this was commonplace at the time, and troops would protect merchants and caravans into and out of the Pete, discouraging any thieves for a good distance around the Pete, for which Kempe Gowda had annexed all the territories around to make it one cohesive unit. And the third reason is that these soldiers would also act as a police force within the Pete, and I don't have to explain this. Finally, there was also the matter of standing troops. The Vijayanagara kingdom expected all its Palegars, and Kempe Gowda was one of them, to maintain a standing army that could be pressed into service on the demand of the emperor. So the troops garrisoned within the Bengaluru Fort could serve that purpose. And for all of these reasons, the fort at the Pete was extremely necessary. So a part of Kempe Gowda's plan for the Pete included building a fort, but the only limiting factor in this plan was that he was only allowed to build a fort that was made of mud. Writing in his memoirs, Portuguese traveller Domingo Paes, who visited Achyutaraya's court, spoke of how under Vijayanagara practice, local chieftains were not permitted to build large stone forts. Let me read from his book. The whole country is thickly populated with cities and towns and villages. The king allows them to be surrounded only with earthen walls for fear of their becoming too strong. But if a city is situated at the extremity of his territory, he gives his consent to having stone walls, but never the towns, so that they may make fortresses of the cities, but not of the towns. About 3 decades earlier, in 1501, a relative of Kempe Gowda's, Malle Baire Gowda, also had to build a mud fort in Devanahalli under dispensation of the Vijayanagara kingdom. So anyway, Bengaluru's fort was first a mud fort. And this was the accepted standard for a Palegar, and Kempe Gowda followed it. And he built this Mannina Kattida Kote, which is Kannada for a fort built with mud. A mud fort may have been weaker than one made of stone, but it was not much easier to build. The result was a triumph of simple engineering, relying entirely on mass, density, and sheer force of labor. Here's how they did it. In Bengaluru, when the outline of the fort had been marked and Kempe Gowda's fort was oval in shape, the builders would have used clay-rich soil because it sort of held together once packed. Now the enclosure itself followed that oval line of a little over a square mile. First, they would have steadied the foundation with a layer of rubble, and then they would have spread the earth, the rich clay, in thin layers, course after course. Teams of workers, using heavy, flat-bottomed rammers or mallets, would then pound that soil repeatedly. This tamping was critical. It squeezed out air pockets, eliminated excess water, and compacted the soil particles tightly together, transforming any loose earth into a dense, rock-hard structure. Now this process was repeated, layer upon layer, kilometer after kilometer, until all the walls had reached a formidable thickness, many meters wide at the base, sloping gently inwards towards the top. Finally, the finished mud walls were typically smoothened and coated with plaster, both for protection and for appearance, and this coating often involved lime and more fine clay. To make access to the Bengaluru Fort itself a little more difficult, along the more vulnerable stretches, workers cut a ditch to form a moat, and that moat was about 25 feet deep. And inside this moat, a thick-set, thorny hedge was planted. Now this was often composed of thorny bushes of different varieties or bamboo or both, and this created a barrier that was reckoned to be impenetrable. Indeed, in later years, it would prove to be highly effective against the Maratha cavalry. Right on the top, the ramparts of the fort would carry narrow openings for matchlocks or rifles, allowing defenders to fire while remaining protected behind the earthwork. The same for archers. Some forts even had cannons attached to them. In the smaller forts of the countryside, the towers served a simpler purpose. They gave a raised platform from which the defenders of the fort, including women in many emergencies, could drop stones or hot oil on anyone attempting to climb the walls. The gateways were the strongest points of the enclosure. They were built narrow and usually arched, forcing riders to dismount before they could come anywhere close. The larger forts sometimes added angled passages and projecting walls around these entrances, but even when such features were present, the defense still depended mainly on what lay outside the gate, the ditch, the thorny hedges, and the organized layout of the settlements that it protected. And by the 1540s, Bengaluru was a functioning provincial center. But even as the town took form on the ground, the empire above it was entering into a period of strain. Achyutaraya's later years brought uncertainty. His death opened the way for Aliyarama-Raya's rise, and the shifting alignments in Vijayanagara soon sucked Kempe Gowda into the vortex of events that lay far beyond his Pete. But for now, the Bengaluru Pete was done, its axes laid out, its trade settled, its gates active, a whole fort in place, and the first complete version of Bengaluru had taken shape. In the next episode, I will turn to the events of the political climate, the rivalries, and the sequence that led to Kempe Gowda's arrest and imprisonment. All that is coming up very soon, so stay right where you are. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.